Dyatlov Pass is a very famous story about these hikers that go missing in the 1950s. They were hiking into the Ural Mountains to take this thing called their Level 3 hiking test.
For more than 6 decades, 9 bodies scattered across a frozen mountainside in the northern Urals have refused to make sense. 9 experienced hikers, young, fit, disciplined, and thoroughly prepared for winter survival, were found dead after a single night in February 1959. Their tent had been cut open from the inside. Their boots and warm clothing were left behind. Some of their bodies showed catastrophic injuries, including crushed ribs and a fractured skull, yet their skin remained strangely unbroken. Radiation was later detected on some of their clothing. A young woman's tongue and parts of her soft tissue were missing. And leading away from the abandoned tent was a trail of footprints disappearing into the darkness, as if 9 people had deliberately walked away from the only shelter they had for miles. When Soviet investigators finally closed the case, they used a phrase so vague that it seemed almost designed to create more questions than answers: a compelling natural force. No animal was named. No attacker was identified. No weapon was found. No clear explanation was given. Just a force. For decades, that phrase became the doorway to one of the strangest mysteries in modern history. Theories multiplied: avalanches, secret military tests, explosions, murder, strange lights, even something far more difficult to explain. But now, modern researchers have returned to the surviving evidence with something the original investigators never had: powerful computer simulations capable of reconstructing the behavior of snow, wind, terrain, and human bodies under extreme conditions. And what these models suggest is not a story about monsters, secret weapons, or something supernatural hiding in the mountains. It may be something far more disturbing, precisely because it could have been completely ordinary. The hikers may have been caught in a chain of events that began with one seemingly harmless decision and ended with 9 people fighting a battle they could never win. Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. But before we reach that final night, we need to return to the beginning, when these 9 young people were still alive, laughing, taking photographs, writing in their diaries, and heading toward a mountain they had no idea would become their grave. It was late January 1959 in Sverdlovsk, a Soviet industrial city that today is known as Yekaterinburg. Winter had transformed the northern Urals into a world of white valleys, frozen rivers, dense forests, and mountains where the temperature could fall to terrifying levels. Into that landscape traveled a group of 10 students and recent graduates, most connected to the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They were not reckless tourists looking for adventure. They were experienced ski hikers who understood winter travel and knew how quickly a mountain could turn dangerous. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student known for his quiet confidence, technical ability, and meticulous preparation. He built equipment himself, studied routes carefully, and had the kind of personality that made other people trust him in difficult situations. The expedition was supposed to be demanding, but it was not supposed to be suicidal. Their destination was Mount Otorten, and reaching it would require crossing some of the most isolated terrain in the region. The group planned to travel through forests and across exposed mountain slopes, carrying food, clothing, skis, equipment, and everything they needed to survive the cold. They knew what they were doing. That fact would become one of the most important details in the entire mystery, because whatever eventually drove them from their tent had to be terrifying enough to overcome the instincts of people who had spent years learning exactly how dangerous the cold could be. And yet, when you look at the photographs they left behind, there is almost nothing that suggests tragedy. The images show ordinary young people enjoying themselves in the snow. They smile at the camera, joke with one another, carry equipment, ski through the landscape, and pose with the carefree confidence of people who believe they still have decades ahead of them. There are faces that would later become famous in photographs attached to one of the 20th century's greatest mysteries. Zinaida Kolmogorova appears energetic and alive. Yuri Doroshenko jokes with the others. Georgy Krivonishenko, known for his humor, appears in photographs looking more like a young man on holiday than someone about to disappear forever. Lyudmila Dubinina kept a diary, as did other members of the group, and those diaries survived. They contained no warnings of an approaching disaster, no strange confession, no indication that anyone believed they were being followed. Instead, they recorded the mundane details of life on the trail: food, weather, equipment, jokes, tired feet, small frustrations, and the endless routine of moving through snow. In some ways, that makes the story even more haunting. There was no dramatic warning before the disaster, no final entry saying that something was wrong. The people in those photographs had no idea that history would remember them not for how they lived, but for the unexplained way they died. On January 28th, the group changed forever. Yuri Yudin, one of the 10 hikers, was suffering from severe pain connected to an old medical problem. He made a decision that must have felt disappointing, but sensible. He turned back. The others continued without him. Yudin would later become the only member of the expedition who survived, and that fact followed him for the rest of his life. He had watched his friends disappear into the snow, expecting that he would eventually see them again. Instead, he became the 10th man, the person who had been there and then walked away just before the journey became a tragedy. The remaining 9 continued north. By January 31st, they had reached the edge of the forest and were preparing for the harder part of the journey. On February 1st, they moved toward the mountain. The weather was deteriorating, visibility was difficult, and the landscape offered very little shelter. At some point, they made a decision that would later become one of the most debated choices in the entire case. Instead of descending toward the forest for the night, they established their tent on an exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl, a mountain whose name is often translated as Dead Mountain. Whether they knew the meaning or attached any significance to it is uncertain. To them, it was simply part of the route. They cut into the snow, created a level platform, assembled their tent, and prepared to spend the night. Their final photographs show them working on that campsite as daylight disappeared. Nothing in those images reveals what was waiting above them. Then, sometime during the night, everything changed. There would be no more ordinary photographs, no more casual diary entries, no final message. Instead, there was a tent left behind in the snow, and eventually, 9 bodies scattered across the mountainside and forest. Investigators would later discover that the tent had been cut open from the inside. The hikers had not simply walked out through the entrance, they had sliced through the fabric itself. That single detail became the heart of the mystery. Why would experienced winter hikers deliberately destroy their only shelter in the middle of a freezing night? Why would they leave their boots, coats, food, and equipment behind? Why would they descend into the darkness wearing inadequate clothing, knowing that exposure could kill them in a matter of hours? Whatever happened inside or immediately outside that tent had convinced them that remaining there was more dangerous than walking into the cold. The footprints found later made the situation even stranger. They appeared to lead downhill toward the forest in an organized line, not as the chaotic tracks of 9 people running blindly in every direction. Some were made by bare feet, others by socks. The hikers seemed to have moved together, away from the tent and toward the trees. They did not return for their equipment. They did not scatter. They simply disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the shelter that should have been their best chance of survival. When the hikers failed to return as scheduled, the delay was initially not considered extraordinary. Mountain expeditions could run late, especially in winter. But as the days passed, concern turned into fear. By February 20th, their families and colleagues were desperate for information. Search parties were assembled. Students, teachers, soldiers, local hunters, and eventually military aircraft joined the effort. The searchers entered the same frozen wilderness the hikers had crossed weeks earlier, moving through snow and wind, trying to find any sign of the missing group. Then, on February 26th, the search team finally found the tent. It was partially buried and damaged, but its location immediately raised questions. The hikers' equipment was still inside. Their warm clothing was there, their boots were there, their food was there. It looked as though the group had abandoned everything in a matter of minutes. And outside the tent, preserved in the snow, was the trail. The searchers followed it downhill toward the forest. The footprints seemed to confirm that the hikers had left together, moving away from the mountain rather than toward the shelter of their tent. Near the edge of the forest stood a large cedar tree. Beneath it, the searchers discovered the first bodies. 2 men lay near the remains of a small fire. Their clothing was inadequate for the condition, and both had died from exposure. The cedar itself showed signs of desperate activity. Branches had been broken high above the ground, suggesting that someone had climbed the tree, perhaps searching for a view of the mountain, or attempting to determine where the others had gone. The scene was terrifying, but at first there seemed to be an explanation. The men had fled the tent, reached the forest, built a fire, and died from the cold. It was tragic, but it was understandable. Then the searchers discovered 3 more bodies scattered between the cedar and the tent. Their positions suggested something even more disturbing. They appeared to have been attempting to climb back toward the campsite. One had managed to travel hundreds of meters uphill before collapsing. Another had fallen farther down the slope. Their bodies created the impression of people who had realized that the forest offered no salvation and were trying to return to the tent they had abandoned. But the cold had already taken too much from them. Their movements had slowed, their strength had disappeared, and one by one they collapsed in the snow. 5 bodies had now been found, and all appeared to have died primarily from hypothermia, but 4 were still missing. The search continued through March as rescuers probed the snow and searched ravines and forested areas. Nothing was found. Then spring arrived. Snow began to melt, frozen ground started to emerge, and in May, the final 4 hikers were discovered in a deep ravine beneath several meters of snow. The discovery transformed the case from a tragic story of exposure into something much stranger. These 4 did not appear to have died simply from the cold. Their bodies showed severe trauma. 1 had a fractured skull. 2 had massive chest injuries, including multiple broken ribs. Yet the skin over those injuries was strangely intact. There were no obvious external wounds that matched the force necessary to cause such damage. It was as if something immensely powerful had crushed them without leaving a corresponding mark on the surface. That was the moment the mystery truly began. The injuries seemed too severe for ordinary hypothermia, yet the scene contained no obvious weapon, no clear attacker, and no conventional explanation. One of the victims, Lyudmila Dubinina, was found with severe soft tissue loss, including the absence of her tongue and damage around the eyes. Later investigations would offer natural explanations involving decomposition and water exposure. But, at the time, details like these became fuel for darker theories. Then came another strange discovery. Some clothing associated with the hikers showed elevated radiation readings. The levels were not considered sufficient to explain their deaths, but in the Soviet Union of the 1950s, where nuclear secrecy surrounded military and industrial activity, even a small amount of unexplained radiation could ignite suspicion. Suddenly, the mountain seemed to contain every ingredient needed for a conspiracy: unexplained injuries, strange footprints, radiation, a secretive government, and a region that was temporarily closed to hikers. The Soviet investigation did not calm those suspicions. Instead, it ended with the famously vague conclusion that the hikers had died because of a compelling natural force. The case was closed. The files were restricted. The families were left with more questions than answers. And over the decades, those unanswered questions became a mythology of their own. Theories multiplied. Some proposed an avalanche. Others imagined a secret military experiment, an explosion, or a pressure wave from a weapon. Reports of strange orange lights in the sky became connected to military activity. Some theories blamed local Mansi people, despite the absence of evidence showing that anyone had attacked the hikers. Others suggested murder, madness, infrasound, extreme winds, a secret missile launch, escaped prisoners, or even something not entirely human. Each theory explained one piece of the evidence while creating another contradiction. An explosion might explain severe trauma, but where was the crater? A murder might explain injuries, but where were the footprints of the attackers? An avalanche might explain why the hikers fled, but why was there so little obvious avalanche debris? And if the hikers were terrified enough to leave their tent, why did they not simply return once they reached the forest? The case became a puzzle in which every answer seemed to unlock one door while closing another. For decades, that was the defining feature of Dyatlov Pass. There was never a shortage of theories. There was a shortage of one theory capable of explaining everything at once. Then modern science changed the question. Instead of asking what mysterious force could have attacked 9 people, researchers began asking something far more ordinary. What was happening to the snow beneath their tent? Engineers who study avalanches approached the mountain as a physical system rather than a crime scene. They reconstructed the slope, the snow layers, the wind conditions, the location of the tent, and the cut the hikers had made into the hillside when they created their campsite. They then used computer modeling to simulate how a slab of wind-packed snow could behave under those exact circumstances. The result was striking. The slope, once considered too shallow for a dangerous avalanche, might not have been as safe as it appeared. By cutting into the hillside to create a flat platform for their tent, the hikers may have disturbed the structure of the snowpack. Above them, wind could have continued depositing snow onto a weak layer. The pressure could have increased gradually through the night until the snow reached a point of failure. The key was that the event did not need to be a massive avalanche. It could have been a relatively small slab release, powerful enough to strike the tent and injure people inside, but small enough to leave little obvious evidence behind by the time rescuers arrived weeks later. That possibility changes the entire sequence of the night. Imagine the hikers asleep or preparing to sleep when the snow suddenly shifts. A compact slab collapses against the tent. Several people are injured immediately. The tent becomes partially blocked or unstable. The group believes another larger collapse could follow. In that moment, survival instincts take over. They cut through the fabric rather than wasting precious seconds fighting with a blocked entrance. They drag or carry the injured away from the slope and descend toward the trees, believing the forest offers safer ground. They leave their boots and coats behind because there is no time to gather them. They are not thinking about surviving the entire night. They are thinking about surviving the next few minutes. And that distinction may explain the decision that has haunted the case for more than 60 years. In the first moments after an avalanche, adrenaline can overwhelm the sensation of cold. The hikers may have believed they could reach the forest, wait for the danger to pass, and then return for their equipment. But once they reached the trees, the mountain presented them with a second enemy, one that was slower but just as lethal. They built a fire beneath the cedar. Some climbed the tree, perhaps searching for the tent or attempting to understand what had happened. 2 died beside the fire. The others realized they needed their clothing and supplies. They began moving back uphill. But by then, their bodies were already losing heat faster than they could replace it. Hypothermia does not always feel like an obvious descent into death. As the body cools, judgment deteriorates, coordination disappears, and eventually consciousness fades. The hikers who attempted to return to the tent may have been fighting a battle they did not realize they had already lost. One collapsed hundreds of meters from the forest. Another fell farther uphill. Eventually, the cold stopped all movement. The final 4, perhaps more heavily injured or separated from the others, ended up in the ravine. Their clothing was later found to have been redistributed, suggesting that the survivors had stripped clothing from those who had already died in an attempt to keep themselves warm. It was not irrational behavior. It was the opposite. It was desperate survival behavior continuing until the final moments. Even the strangest details begin to look different under this explanation. The missing tongue and damaged eyes do not necessarily require violence or mutilation. The bodies of the final 4 remained beneath snow and meltwater for months, creating conditions in which soft tissue could be damaged by decomposition and scavenging. The radiation found on some clothing does not automatically point to a secret weapon. There were ordinary sources of exposure associated with the hikers' lives and equipment that could potentially account for elevated readings. The orange lights reported in the region do not prove a connection to the deaths. They may have been unrelated atmospheric or military phenomena. And the absence of obvious avalanche debris may no longer be fatal to the theory if the event was a small slab release rather than the enormous avalanche imagined by earlier investigators. One by one, the most mysterious details begin to lose their supernatural power. They become pieces of a physical chain reaction. But there is an important distinction. A computer model does not travel back to 1959. It does not recover a missing witness. It does not find a photograph hidden inside the snow. It cannot produce a confession from a mountain. What modern modeling can do is something more limited and, perhaps, more valuable. It can demonstrate that an explanation once considered unlikely is physically possible. It can show that the slope could fail, that the snowpack could behave in a particular way, and that a relatively small slab could generate severe trauma under the right circumstances. It can connect weather, terrain, snow mechanics, and human behavior into one coherent sequence. But coherent is not the same as proven. The people who could have told us exactly what happened died that night, and the physical evidence changed as the snow melted, the bodies decomposed, and the landscape returned to its natural state. That is why the Dyatlov Pass mystery still refuses to disappear. Skeptics continue to point out that the hikers were experienced winter travelers and question whether they would have made certain choices required by the avalanche scenario. They point to the absence of obvious debris and argue that important pieces of the explanation remain assumptions. Supporters of the avalanche model answer that the entire point is that this may not have been a conventional avalanche at all. Its small size, unusual mechanics, and delayed failure could explain why the evidence was so difficult to recognize decades later. Neither side possesses the one piece of evidence that would end the argument forever. Both are working with the same frozen photographs, the same autopsy reports, the same footprints, the same mountain, and the same impossible night. And perhaps that is what makes the modern explanation more haunting than the older theories. For decades, people imagined that something extraordinary had entered that tent. A monster, a weapon, a secret experiment, a mysterious force, something intelligent enough to terrify 9 people into abandoning everything they needed to survive. But what if there was nothing extraordinary there at all? What if the hikers were not attacked by an enemy? What if they simply made one decision that seemed reasonable in the darkness, and then a series of ordinary physical processes took over? Snow shifted. Wind loaded the slope. A shelter became unsafe. Adrenaline pushed them toward the trees. The temperature continued to fall. Clothing became scarce. Judgment deteriorated. And the cold finished what the snow had started. No monster, no killer, no hidden creature waiting beyond the firelight. Just snow, wind, darkness, and a chain of small decisions that became irreversible. The mountain did not hate them. It did not choose them. It did not need to. That may be the most frightening lesson of Dyatlov Pass. 9 young people who knew how to survive in the wilderness entered the mountains believing that preparation could protect them from almost anything. And perhaps their preparation did save them from the first danger, because they escaped the tent. But survival is not a single decision. It is a chain. One broken link can destroy everything that came before it. The hikers may have survived the initial disaster only to walk directly into the second one. They may have escaped the snow only to lose the battle against the cold. And by the time they understood what was happening, there may have been no way back. More than 6 decades later, the photographs remain. The diaries remain. The footprints are gone. The snow is gone. The people are gone. What remains is a mountain, a handful of physical clues, and a question that has outlived everyone who was there. What really happened during those final hours? Perhaps modern science has finally brought us closer than ever to an answer. Perhaps the avalanche theory explains the impossible sequence better than anything before it. Or perhaps one critical detail is still missing, hidden somewhere in the darkness between the tent and the trees. We may never know with absolute certainty, but maybe that uncertainty is exactly why this story has survived for so long. Because Dyatlov Pass is not just a mystery about 9 deaths. It is a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying explanation is not that something unknown came for you in the darkness. Sometimes the darkness itself is enough. One man had a shattered skull. The bone had cracked as though struck by tremendous force, yet there was no corresponding wound on the skin above it. 2 others had suffered massive chest fractures, with multiple ribs broken and driven inward, the kind of injuries a pathologist at the time compared to the impact of a car crash or a fall from a great height. And yet, once again, the skin over those crushed chests was unbroken. There were no cuts, no punctures, no obvious signs that anything had struck them from the outside. Whatever force had caved in their ribs and cracked their skulls had somehow done so without tearing the surface of their bodies. It was a pressure so immense that it appeared to have destroyed them from within, almost like the crushing force experienced by a diver descending into water far deeper than the human body can withstand. The injuries were horrifying, but they were also strangely clean, and that contradiction would become one of the most important pieces of the mystery. And there was another detail. These 4 hikers, unlike the 5 discovered earlier, were better dressed, but the clothes they wore did not necessarily belong to them. Layers had been taken from the bodies of those who had already died near the cedar, cut away, redistributed, and worn by the survivors who were still desperately trying to stay warm. That small detail revealed something profoundly human in the middle of the horror. The group had not simply collapsed into chaos. They had been thinking. They had recognized that some of their friends were dead, and they had taken whatever clothing they could find because they understood that without it, they would die too. It suggested that the hikers were still making rational decisions, even after the disaster had begun. The two men at the fire had apparently died first, and the others had salvaged their clothing before moving deeper into the forest, and eventually toward the ravine. The sequence was grim, but it was not irrational. These were people trying to survive until the very end. Then investigators recovered the body of Lyudmila Dubinina, and one detail immediately stood out. Her tongue was missing, along with portions of soft tissue around her mouth and eyes. For decades, that single discovery would become one of the most disturbing details in the entire case. It was easy to imagine the worst: torture, mutilation, a deliberate attack, something inhuman, something that had happened to the hikers after death, or perhaps something that had happened while they were still alive. The possibilities were dark enough that the missing tissue became a permanent feature of the Dyatlov Pass mythology. But the reality may have been far less mysterious. Dubinina's body had spent months beneath snow and meltwater in a ravine. Soft tissue is especially vulnerable to decomposition, water, and scavenging. The tongue, eyes, and other exposed tissues are among the first parts of a body that can disappear under those conditions. It was a grim natural process, but natural explanations rarely feel satisfying when they are applied to something this disturbing. Standing over the body of a young woman in a frozen ravine, knowing she had once been laughing with her friends only weeks earlier, the idea that decomposition could explain the damage did little to answer the larger question: how had she ended up there in the first place? Then came the radiation. When investigators examined clothing recovered from the ravine, some garments showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination. The readings were not high enough to explain the deaths, and they did not necessarily indicate a dangerous exposure. But the discovery occurred in the Soviet Union during an era when nuclear technology was surrounded by secrecy, military speculation, and government censorship. Suddenly, a strange possibility appeared. Could the hikers have witnessed something they were never supposed to see? Had they been caught near a secret weapons test? Had some military accident occurred on the mountain? Or was the radiation simply connected to ordinary sources from the hikers' lives and equipment? The evidence itself did not provide an obvious answer, but mystery does not require certainty. Sometimes it only requires one unexplained detail, and the radiation was enough to keep the imagination alive for generations. A dead hiker's sweater had registered radioactive contamination on an empty mountain in the middle of nowhere. For people searching for a hidden explanation, that was more than enough to begin building a conspiracy.